BBC chairman Richard Sharp has faced a grilling from the Commons Culture Committee over his involvement in Boris Johnson's financial affairs. Appointed by Johnson in 2021, it's since emerged that Sharp's path to broadcaster's top job might have taken some unconventional turns. That's because it's been reported that Sharp may have helped the then Prime Minister to secure a loan of up to £800,000 in late 2020. It seems that despite his £165,000 a year salary, Johnson was facing an early cost of living crisis of his own. Before we play the first clip, I want to introduce one more character into the mix. This is Sam Blythe, a Canadian businessman. He's a distant cousin of Johnson's and an old friend of Sharp's. Amazing how everyone in this story seems to be a millionaire who already knows everybody else. Funny how that works. In the committee, Sharp gave the background to the scandal.
The starting point, in the way you described it, is my long-standing relationship and friendship with Mr. Blythe. He's somebody I met after he'd left university and after I'd left university some 40 years ago. So Mr. Blythe is a personal friend of mine who I've known for some time. As a result of press reports that he had read in September, he raised with me at that time his concern that his cousin, the Prime Minister, was reported in these press reports to have some difficulties. Mr. Blythe raised with me the fact that he was interested in feeling about whether he should do something to help. He raised that with me at a private dinner at his house. I said to him at that time, you may be a family member, but you need to be very careful. Things need to be done by the book. There are rules in this country, and these rules exist for a good reason. You're a foreigner, and therefore, before you contemplate doing anything or providing any assistance to the Prime Minister, you should involve the Cabinet Office. And he raised that issue with me, and that was the end of it at that point in time.
But was that the end of it? Johnson's loan was apparently finalised in February of 2021. The Times report this. Before the loan was finalised, Johnson, Sharp and Blythe had a private dinner at Chequers, the Prime Minister's grace and favour home in the Chiltern Hills in Buckinghamshire, where, according to a source, they ate chop suey and drank wine. The three insist that Johnson's finances were not discussed. While all that was going on, Sharp put in his application to be the BBC chairman. The Times reports this. Sharp submitted his application in October 2020 after Charles Moore, a former editor of the Daily Telegraph and Johnson's initial choice for the role, withdrew from the contest. Sharp had privately discussed the idea with Johnson, whom he had previously served as a City Hall economics advisor. The pair are long-standing friends, having seen one another socially in London and gone on skiing holidays in the past. According to a source, Johnson told Sharp, "Let's make the BBC great." By November, Robert Peston, the ITV political editor, reports that ministers were telling would-be applicants, don't waste your time applying. The PM has made up his mind, it will be Richard Sharp. Just days after the alleged Chequers dinner, Sharp was announced as having won the position. But Sharp denies he ever gave the Prime Minister any financial advice, a claim that DCMS committee chair Damien Green found hard to believe. In the clip we're about to show you, another character emerges. That's Simon Case. He's the Cabinet Secretary, the UK's most senior civil servant.
You've said this morning that you never provided financial advice.
Yes.
And yet there's a Cabinet Office note from Simon Case to Boris Johnson saying, given the imminent announcement of Richard Sharp as a new BBC chair, it is important that you no longer ask his advice about your personal financial matters. That seems to contradict what you've just said.
Well, I haven't seen that memo.
Well, it was in the Sunday Times 2 weeks ago.
I haven't seen the memo itself. I've seen the report of the memo, obviously. And in fact, I discussed that with the Cabinet Office. What Mr. Case undertook to me, and I was very grateful for that at the meeting, he said, I will ensure you have no further part in this. And I had no further part in this. And so that memo, and I discussed this with a cabinet official, because I only learned about this over the weekend when as you did, when a journalist put that to me. I learned from the Cabinet Office, it did refer to the meeting that I'd had with Mr. Johnson, which was alerting him to the fact that I was going to go and see Mr. Case. And at that meeting, I did not provide Mr. Johnson advice. And I think it was an ambiguous construction that obviously is open to misinterpretation. I've never given the Prime Minister advice. He's never sought it. I know nothing about his personal financial affairs. And so I take it that that phrasing, and I had that confirmed to me unofficially by the Cabinet Office before the article was written, was that referred to the fact that their efforts were to prevent me from receiving any calls from the Prime Minister to protect my position and to protect his, for that matter.
So let me get this straight. You can know the Prime Minister needs a huge loan, but also know absolutely nothing about his private financial affairs. Okay. As part of Sharp's appointment as chairman, he was interviewed in 2021 by the Culture Committee. So shouldn't he then have mentioned his connection to Blythe and Johnson? And that's a line of questioning Labour's Kevin Brennan was keen to press.
If you were sitting on this committee, wouldn't you be just a little bit disgruntled, so I put it that way, about the fact that when you appeared before the committee, you chose not to tell us about this?
Well, look, I think one of the reasons why I'm welcoming this opportunity is because there's been a lot of assertions about things that have taken place.
I'm not making any assertions of that kind.
Which have mischaracterised, as far as I'm concerned, my involvement. My involvement was to ensure due process was followed. Well, I was not party to any subsequent events that took place. I gave no financial advice to the Prime Minister. I gave no financial advice to Mr. Blythe.
Well, look, we're going over old ground, but I'm not asking you that, am I? I'm asking you to put yourself in our position for a moment, in our role in this matter. And if you were sat in the House of Commons whilst ministers prayed in aid, this committee's report, when it interviewed you in the pre-appointment hearing, to say nothing to see here, and when they're appearing all over the media saying, oh, the DCMS Select Committee said it was fine, so there's not a problem, and you're a member of this committee, and you find out that in fact you did not disclose to this committee the fact that you were involved in making introductions which would result in a very large soft loan facility being made available to the very person responsible for appointing you to the job which was under consideration. How on earth did you think that was not a relevant matter to disclose to this committee?
Well, as I've described...
Do you regret it?
I'll come back to that particular... As I've described to you, I acted in good faith to ensure that due process was followed, including an open declaration to the Cabinet Secretary about the issue occurring at the same time I was applying to be the BBC chair.
I mean, you might as well just say I refer you to the answer I gave previously in true House of Commons style. But do you not see why we might be unhappy about that?
With respect to the regret, obviously, I regret the situation. I particularly regret the situation for the BBC.
That's a non-regret, though, isn't it?
No, it's not. It's not at all.
We all regret everything. I non-regret the regret, and I regret the non-regret. Anyway, let's try and introduce another millionaire to the mix. You guessed it. It's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who also happens to be an old friend of Richard Sharp's. They worked together at Goldman Sachs. Where else? And Sharp was an advisor to Sunak when he was Chancellor. Asked about Sharp's appearance at the Culture Committee, Sunak had this to say.
The BBC chair has just told the Select Committee this morning that he told Boris Johnson he was applying to be BBC chair, and he told him he was in touch with Sam Blythe about a loan. In what world is that acceptable?
Well, this is obviously about an appointment that was made by a previous Prime Minister before I took this job, so it's hard for me to comment on the details of it. What I do know is that his appointment process was conducted rigorously and transparently. It was approved by a panel of experts and indeed a cross-party select committee in Parliament. But it is right that people have confidence in the process, and that's why the Independent Commissioner of Public Appointments is re-looking at the process to make sure that everything was done correctly.
Do you think people can have any confidence in the process? It just looks like establishment cronyism, doesn't it?
Well, as I said, at the time, the process was considered to be one that was conducted fairly rigorously, transparently, in line with all the guidance set out that exists for these things. A cross-party group of MPs in Parliament thought the process was good and recommended that Richard Sharp was appointed. An expert panel of independent people also said the same thing. But it's right that now the Independent Commissioner on Public Appointments is really looking at the process so people can have that confidence.
So the Prime Minister there appealing to the thoroughness of the Select Committee process. But how thorough can it be if the candidate, Sharp, didn't disclose important information to it? Harriet, how confident are you of the various processes by which we're judging as to whether or not Richard Sharp is telling the whole truth, and where precisely Boris Johnson got this money from?
I mean, they're playing us for mugs. It's wild how by having a posh accent and a lot of money, you can wriggle your way through these situations. And like in that select committee, Richard Sharp said that he let Sam Blythe know that he'd put in an application to a B chain. He could have no part in it going forward. What other parts could he have had? He introduced them. Like, what else could he have done? He's not going to be like, oh, look, boys, I can't sign the cheque because that'll be too far. Like, what? It's an £800,000 loan. And then he said he had no knowledge of the PM's finances. Then why did you think a meeting was necessary? This is absolute nonsense. And the government had previously said that Sharp was appointed on merit. And I think it's a bit of a stretch to ask the public to perceive the BBC in particular as the highest quality of news and journalism when the chairman can't even tell the truth. I think it has a knock-on effect for the BBC that is really quite damaging. And if I was a BBC journalist, I think I'd be pretty annoyed at this because it will bring people's public reputation or public understanding of the BBC into disrepute. And they will see this for what it is, which is cronyism. Regardless of your opinion on the BBC, these rich men are using it as their playground, and it's pretty foul. And I was kind of reflecting on how someone gets into this position and gets away with this kind of stuff. And I was thinking about the social mobility. And I feel like, Aaron, I was sold a lie around social mobility. I was told, go to university, your life will be changed forever, you'll be part of the middle class. I used to go into schools in Merthyr and encourage kids to go to university, and I'd say it would change your life. Now, some of this is true, obviously, but there's one thing that I and other kids from Merthyr, and probably yourself, will never be, is no matter how hard we work, is that we will never be part of this gang of rich elites who use entire countries and countries' institutions as their playgrounds. This class within a class that will always back itself up. In their eyes will always be the working class to be lied to and deceived, but it's so blatantly obvious. Like, anyone watching that select committee would just think it's absurd. But I guess the worrying thing is they have so much unchecked power and influence that it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what the public thinks. If you're going to fund the Prime Minister and are best mates with the Prime Minister, like, think of all of the scandals under the Boris Johnson government, and many of these ministers have had. There's nothing the public can say or really do because they have so much power. They can get away with it.